Get your bag, get up, and get to the back of this plane before I have you removed in front of everyone watching." The words didn't land like a request. They landed like a verdict, already written before the trial began, read aloud only because procedure required it. Renee Castellan stood in the aisle of the first-class cabin, with her arms folded across a navy blazer that had exactly 24 years of creases ironed out of it. And she said it the way a woman says something she has said before, and expects to never be questioned about again. Behind that sentence was a woman named Dominique Ashworth, who had not moved, who had not blinked, who had simply looked up from her tablet, the way a person looks up from a thought they intend to finish later. Before we go further, stay with me, because in 19 minutes, this aircraft is going to sit dead still on the runway at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, with every engine off, and the woman giving that order is going to be the one escorted away in handcuffs. Not Dominique, Renee. But that's 19 minutes from now. Let's go back to 5:52 that morning, because what happened on Palisade Airways Flight 483 didn't start in the aisle. It started 3 hours earlier in a black car crossing the Yadkin River Bridge in the dark, where a phone screen lit up a woman's face with 4 words that would end up mattering more than anyone on that flight could have guessed. "Deal is signed, Ms. Ashworth." Dominique Ashworth was 37 years old. She had a company most people had never heard of, and every serious person in freight logistics feared. Ironbridge Global Logistics had started 11 years earlier in a rented duplex in Winston-Salem, with a folding table, a second-hand laptop, and a 41-page analysis of why cargo containers sat idle for 6 extra days at every port between Norfolk and Savannah. She had mailed that analysis, unsolicited, to 14 shipping executives. 2 had called back. 1 had hired her as a contractor within the month. 14 months later, she had quit to build the fix herself, because contracting for someone else's slow decision had started to feel like watching a fire from behind glass. Ironbridge was now worth just over $14 billion and moved freight through 22 countries. Dominique did not look like that number, and she never had. And she had stopped trying to look like it. Around the same time, she stopped apologizing for not looking like it. She wore a plain white blouse, dark trousers, low heels chosen for 11 hours of travel rather than for effect. Her hair was pulled back in a low twist that took 4 minutes each morning and held all day. Her only jewelry was a small brass compass pendant on a thin chain, tarnished at the edges, worn soft at the hinge from 40 years of thumbs running over it before hers. It had belonged to her grandmother, Odessa, who had cleaned office buildings in downtown Charlotte for 31 years and told her exactly one thing on the porch. The summer Dominique turned 16 and got rejected from a scholarship program for looking, in the words of the letter, not quite the right fit. A compass doesn't care what room decides it belongs somewhere else. It just keeps pointing at true. Dominique had touched that pendant before every difficult negotiation of her adult life. She touched it now, once, out of habit, sitting in the back of a car on the Billy Graham Parkway at 5:58 in the morning, while her attorney read the final signature page aloud over speakerphone and her assistant, Farah Osei, confirmed on a second line that the wire had cleared. 53% of Palisade Airways, $2.7 billion. A regional carrier running 41 domestic routes and bleeding money on 6 of them through nothing more complicated than bad scheduling logic. Anyone with a working spreadsheet could have fixed in a weekend. Nobody at Palisade Airways knew yet. The press release was set for noon Pacific. Dominique had asked for exactly one thing before the world found out. She wanted to fly the airline once, as an ordinary passenger, before her name changed what every gate agent and flight attendant on the payroll would see when they looked at her. She wanted to know what her airline did to people when nobody was watching. She got her answer 41 minutes after boarding. Keep that compass in mind. It comes back at the very end, and when it does, you'll understand exactly why she never took it off. She had been the first passenger down the jet bridge, not because she hurried, because she never hurried, but because her internal clock ran precisely enough that she arrived with room for one coffee and an unhurried walk. She handed her boarding pass to a gate agent named Talia Fenwick, 26 years old, whose name tag Dominique read, and whose eyes she met when she said, "Thank you." She had made a habit of that since she was 23. The people treated as invisible by powerful passengers were almost always the ones working the counter. She took seat 1A. She opened her tablet. She began reviewing merger paperwork she'd already signed 3 hours earlier. Mostly because stillness, without a task, made her mind circle back to things she didn't have room to feel yet. The man in 1B arrived 9 minutes later. Walter Grimshaw, 59. A regional pipeline executive with the particular red-collared confidence of a man who had never once had his boarding pass questioned in his life. He glanced at Dominique's blouse, at her carry-on, at the absence of any visible logo anywhere on her body, ran some silent calculation behind his eyes, and looked away without a word. She had learned to track that silence the way sailors track a shift in wind, not with alarm, with information. It told her something about the room. It was almost never wrong. Renee Castellan had spent the first 8 minutes of boarding refilling Walter Grimshaw's water glass twice, without being asked, laughing at a joke about golf handicaps that wasn't especially funny, and calling a silver-haired man in 2C by name, because she'd apparently memorized his frequent flyer profile from a prior flight. She was warm. She was attentive. She was, by every visible measure, extremely good at her job, for the passengers who fit the picture in her head of who belonged in that cabin. That was the part that made her dangerous. Cruelty that announces itself is easy to spot and easier to punish. Cruelty that only shows up selectively, dressed as diligence, aimed only at the people it's decided don't quite fit. That kind survives 24 years in a personnel file with nothing but reviewed and resolved stamped across every complaint. She believed, genuinely and completely, that she was the last careful person standing between an orderly cabin and chaos. That belief was going to be the whole engine of what happened next. And it was never going to occur to her, not once, that the belief itself was the problem. She came through the galley curtain at 6:34, scanning the cabin with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had run this exact route for 6 years and knew every armrest by feel. Her eyes moved down the row and caught, just barely, on seat 1A. The hesitation lasted 1.5 seconds. Dominique clocked it, the way she clocked everything, without effort. The counting so old it no longer felt like counting. 24 years Renee Castellan had worked for this airline. 3 prior complaints sat quietly in a personnel file. Nobody had looked at in 14 months, filed by 2 coworkers and 1 passenger, each one stamped reviewed and resolved by the same regional supervisor who had never once opened an investigation. Renee did not know that file existed in the hands of someone who could read it. Not yet. She approached seat 1A with her tablet already half raised, already performing the motion of checking something she had already decided not to believe. "Excuse me, I'm going to need you to gather your things." Dominique looked up. "I have a first-class boarding pass, seat 1A full fare," she said, and held up her phone. Her voice was even, not cold. Cold defends itself. Even is something else. Even is a woman who has decided not to give someone the reaction they're expecting. Renee didn't take the phone. "Digital passes get duplicated all the time," she said. "We've had incidents. I'll need your original confirmation and a photo ID." Dominique produced both, without a sigh, without hesitation. The 4th piece of documentation she'd offer in 6 minutes on a flight that hadn't even pushed back yet. She set them on the tray table, rather than handing them over, the small distinction of a courtesy rather than a surrender. Renee picked up the ID, held it at arm's length, the way you examine something you already believe is fake. Looked at the ID, looked at Dominique, looked at the ID again, and then she set it down without checking the manifest at all. That was the moment. Not the words at the top of the aisle, not the sweep of her arm toward economy that would come 6 minutes later. That single decision, to hand back documentation without ever opening the system that would have proven it true, was where everything that followed was born. If you've ever handed someone proof and watched them decide not to look at it, you already know the particular kind of fury that isn't loud. It's quiet, and it sits behind the sternum, and it does not go away just because you smile through it. Tell me in the comments, has that happened to you? Because in about 90 seconds, it's about to get much, much worse for Dominique Ashworth, and I promise you, the woman doing it has no idea what's about to land on her. 9 rows back, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Voss set her paperback face down in her lap. Eleanor was 71, silver hair in a bob. She'd worn the same way for 2 decades because it suited her and she'd never seen the point in changing what worked. 40 years, teaching 7th grade English in Matthews, had given her a very finely tuned instrument for watching adults decide how to treat other people. And every instinct she had was now standing at full attention. Across the aisle, a younger man named Bennett Cole quietly angled his phone toward the front of the cabin and pressed record. He didn't know why yet. He just knew that something was starting that he wanted to still exist after it ended. There may be a priority tier conflict, Renee said, not looking at Dominique when she said it. Hold on. She called a colleague named Nolan Cassidy from the galley. He scrolled the tablet, frowned, scrolled again, leaned toward Renee and said, loud enough for the first 2 rows to hear, bookings clean. Full fare, no conflicts. Something moved across Renee's face, not surprise exactly. More like recalculation, the look of someone recomputing a story rather than abandoning it. Escalation number 1. Private, almost deniable, the kind of moment that could still be explained away as an honest mix-up if it stopped right there. Didn't stop. Renee straightened her shoulders and raised her voice, just enough to carry past the curtain, to row 3, to row 5, to anyone with their headphones still off. Ma'am, I need you to understand that we have a system for a reason, and I am not going to let one passenger disrupt the boarding process for 211 other people, because she doesn't want to follow it. 211 other people. Walter Grimshaw in 1B turned a page of his newspaper. His eyes didn't move with it. Eleanor Voss's hand tightened on her book. That was escalation number 2. Public, deliberate, dressed up as concern for the collective, aimed precisely at the one passenger who hadn't broken any rule at all. Dominique did not raise her voice back. She set her hands flat on the tray table, palms down, and said, I've shown you 4 forms of documentation. It had. I'd like you to check the manifest. Renee reached up and pressed the call button for the purser station, and when the second flight attendant arrived, she said the sentence that would end her career before either of them understood what she'd actually done. Get airport security. I have a non-compliant passenger refusing to deplane. That was escalation number 3, and it was the one you can't take back. A legal action with a legal weight. A lie stated to a badge launched at a woman who had done nothing but sit in the seat she'd paid for and ask to be believed. Dominique didn't stand right away. She let the cabin hold its breath first. Somewhere near row 4, a phone camera stayed exactly where it had been pointed. The forward galley smelled faintly of burnt coffee grounds someone had forgotten under the warmer. Outside the small oval window, Charlotte's morning traffic crawled along I-77 in a gray haze that hadn't burned off yet. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was the specific stillness of 211 people watching one woman decide, in real time, whether the world she'd built for herself was strong enough to hold what was happening to her right now. Then Dominique stood. She buttoned her blazer. She picked up her bag. And she walked the length of that cabin without a single word, past Walter Grimshaw's newspaper, past Eleanor Voss's held breath, past Bennett Cole's phone still recording, and off the aircraft, escorted by two airport officers who had been told they were retrieving a security threat and found. Instead, a woman who set her bag down calmly and asked, quietly, if she could see their supervisor's name. 28 years earlier, at a different gate in a different city, a 19-year-old Dominique had sat on the floor of Concourse B at O'Hare with a bungee-corded suitcase between her knees, watching her flight push back without her, because a gate agent had spent 37 minutes deciding a mileage upgrade ticket she'd booked herself, 3 weeks in advance, with money she'd saved working 2 jobs, had to be somebody's mistake. She had not cried that day. She had called the woman running her summer internship in Chicago, said 2 sentences, and heard back, without missing a beat, "Honey, get the next flight. We'll hold your start date." She'd landed 9 hours and 11 minutes late. She'd become the best intern that logistics company had ever hired. And she'd learned, sitting on that floor at 19, the exact lesson she was living out again right now at 37 in a different airport in a different blazer. The obstacle never disappears just because you're right. You build something the obstacle can't survive. You grow past it in a direction it never considered. There was a second memory, one Dominique didn't reach for often, but it surfaced now the way it always did, without invitation, in the 4 seconds before a door opened somewhere, and changed everything again. She was 28. Ironbridge was 3 years old. 40 employees, $18 million in annual revenue. Real, undeniably real, but not yet the kind of real a stranger recognized on sight. She'd been invited to deliver the opening keynote at a logistics innovation summit in Nashville, the youngest speaker on the program, and the only woman in the first slot. And she'd spent 3 weeks writing 22 minutes of remarks she planned to deliver without notes. She'd boarded first class, opened her laptop, and started her final read-through when a flight attendant in his 40s stopped at her row. "Are you in the right section?" he'd asked. She showed him her pass without looking up. "I can see that," he said, in the tone of a man who'd decided documentation required a second opinion. "But these seats are usually corporate priority. Do you have a company card?" She handed it over. Ironbridge Global Logistics, full legal name, her title beneath it. "Is this your company?" "Yes." "What does it do?" She told him, briefly, without apology, because she'd explained it 1,000 times by then, and had stopped performing the explanation like it needed to earn her the seat. He was quiet for 2.5 seconds. She counted. She always counted, reading the card again like it might change if he stared at it long enough. "Ironbridge," he said. "Never heard of it." He handed the card back. He didn't ask her to move. He backed away with the careful neutrality of a man retreating from a position without ever admitting he'd held it, and then he served every other first-class passenger drink. Refills, warm towels, pillow adjustments, twice over. 11 passes down that aisle in 2 hours, and not one of them stopped at her row again. She'd tracked it the same way she tracked shipping manifests, because data about herself didn't stop being data just because it was uncomfortable to hold. That night, in a Nashville hotel room after a standing ovation, she'd built a wall around the memory, not to seal it away, but to store it correctly, not as a wound, but as a lesson. One person's regret never changed the architecture of anything. What changed the architecture was building something so undeniably real that the question itself became impossible to ask. She'd been building toward that for 9 years. Today was supposed to be the day she finally arrived, and here she was again, in a different room, listening for footsteps. The holding room at Charlotte Douglas was small, gray, and smelled like industrial carpet cleaner. Officer Diego Ruiz set a paper cup of black coffee in front of her without being asked. "It's black," he said. "Didn't know how you take it." "Black's fine," Dominique said. "Thank you." He stood near the door a while before he spoke again. "For what it's worth, I didn't clock you as a threat when we walked up. My partner followed the call. I followed my partner. I should have asked more questions before I did." "Why tell me that?" Dominique asked. He was quiet, choosing honesty over comfort. "I've got a daughter, Maya, 9 years old. Smart, asks about everything, doesn't let anything go. She's going to grow up and walk into rooms like this one someday." He paused. "I don't want this to be what's waiting for her." "Tell Maya," Dominique said, and her voice went quieter than it had been all morning, "that the door doesn't always open the first time, but it opens. You just have to still be standing there when it does." She had not been idle in that room. She'd written a time-stamped account of everything said, every name, every witness position, in the Notes app on her phone. She'd texted Farah, "Confirm the 6/2 signing timestamp. Send me the signed agreement, page 12, the ownership registration." It came back in 90 seconds. She'd opened Palisade Airways' internal HR system. Lived to her since 6:02 that morning. Because majority ownership came with administrator credentials, nobody had thought to revoke or restrict. And pulled Renee Castellan's personnel file. 3 pages. A complaint summary section on page 3. 3 prior incidents over 16 months. 2 filed by coworkers, 1 by a passenger, every single one marked reviewed and resolved by the same regional supervisor, none of them showing evidence of an actual investigation. She read it twice. She was not surprised. She was cold, the specific cold of finding confirmation of something you already understood. Her phone buzzed. "Farah, you're trending. Bennett Cole's video has 94,000 views in 11 minutes. Seat 1A is a hashtag now. 3 outlets have the clip." She watched it once, from the outside, from Bennett Cole's angle in row 4. Watched herself hold up her phone while Renee looked past it. Watched herself stand, button her blazer, walk. She set the phone face down and picked her coffee back up. She did not look like a woman who'd just gone viral. She looked like a woman who had received one more piece of data and was folding it into a calculation, already running. She heard footsteps outside the door. Fast ones, in heels, moving at the particular pace of someone trying to walk quickly without looking like they were running, and failing. Here's the thing nobody in that cabin knew yet, and it's the reason what happens next hits as hard as it does. 7 minutes before those footsteps started, Captain Marcus Whitlock had come out of the cockpit, spoken to a corporate contact on a satellite line, and learned exactly who had just been walked off his aircraft. 29 years he'd been flying for this airline, and he had never once grounded a plane over a personnel dispute. He was about to become the first. His voice came through every speaker on the aircraft, calm, unhurried, and absolutely final. "This flight will not depart until Ms. Ashworth is returned to her seat, and this situation is properly reviewed. I am not comfortable operating an aircraft under these conditions." The cabin went silent in a way that had weight to it. Somewhere behind the galley curtain, Renee was mid-pour on a glass of champagne for a passenger in 3C, and the bottle stopped moving, tilted at an angle that let 3 ounces spill onto the carpet before she set it down. Nobody moved to clean it. The particular hush of 211 people rearranging, in real time, everything they thought they understood about the last 40 minutes filled the cabin like a held breath. Nobody wanted to be first to release. Eleanor Voss's voice cut through it, clear and satisfied. "I knew it." That's the sound of the door starting to open, the kind you can't hear from inside the room where Dominique was sitting. But you and I can. And it opens wider in about 4 minutes. When Renee Castellan comes through that door to try to undo, with an apology, what she'd already done with an accusation. The door opened. Renee stood in the frame, not quite breathless, a strand of hair loose from its clip, wearing an expression Dominique hadn't seen on her once in the cabin. The specific, unguarded look of someone who has just understood the size of what they've done and hasn't decided yet what to do with the understanding. "Ms. Ashworth," she said, "the captain is holding the flight. I need you to come back." "I know," Dominique said. She did not stand. She let the silence do the work silence does when one person fills it with understanding and the other has to catch up. "I want to explain what happened out there," Renee said. "I was protecting the integrity of the cabin. There's a process for a reason, and I followed protocol as I understood it in the moment. That's the part worth pausing on, because it's the part that decides everything that comes after." She didn't say I was wrong. She said I followed protocol as I understood it. Watch that sentence. It's going to reappear, word for word, in about 11 minutes, in front of a detective, and it's going to be the exact sentence that ends her career. Dominique stood, finally, and walked back down the jet bridge, with Renee 2 steps behind her. Past Walter Grimshaw, who did not look up, past Eleanor Voss, who watched every step, past Bennett Cole's phone, still recording. She took seat 1A. Renee stood at the front of the cabin, hands shaking slightly, and made an announcement over the PA that every passenger on board would later describe slightly differently. But every version agreed on the shape of it, an acknowledgement that a mistake had occurred, phrased so carefully around the word, sorry, that several passengers noticed. She never actually said it. Wheels didn't leave the ground. Not yet. Dominique's phone lit up again. Farah, this time with urgency threaded through the text. Grant Weller convened 3 board members in a downtown conference room, the second the acquisition news leaked early. He's invoking the emergency control clause. He wants to strip your operational authority before this plane lands. Dominique read it twice, typed back, "Has legal reviewed his standing to invoke it?" 40 seconds later. Weller's named in active litigation with 2 private creditors. Under Palisade's own bylaws, a board member facing personal financial litigation can't vote on executive matters. Conflict of interest. His vote is void. Senator Patricia Lowell's office has independently confirmed the reading. Does he know his vote is void? Dominique typed. "He does not appear to," Farah replied. Dominique looked out the window at the Carolina pines running along the runway's edge. Felt nothing that resembled fear, felt instead the specific cold clarity that came whenever the board was exactly where she needed it. Grant Weller had built a plan for the woman he assumed he was dealing with. He had not done sufficient diligence on the one who actually showed up. That was, in her experience, the single most expensive mistake anyone ever made about her. "Prepare the statement," she typed to Farah. "I'll call from the gate in Seattle. Get Senator Lowell on the line before I clear the terminal." The wheels finally left Charlotte's runway at 7:19, 19 minutes late, and somewhere over the Blue Ridge. The cabin settled into the strange, charged quiet of people who had just watched something they wouldn't be able to fully describe to anyone who hadn't been there. Detective Rosa Delgado was waiting at the gate in Seattle before the jet bridge had even finished sealing to the door. 44 years old, flat, unhurried attention. The look of someone who had stopped being surprised by almost anything years ago and had just discovered a new exception. She'd gotten the call from Renee 40 minutes into the flight, placed from the galley phone before the captain's announcement, before any of it. A call reporting a non-compliant passenger creating a security disturbance. She was expecting a Category 2 incident. She found a woman sitting calmly in 1A, with a tablet open on her tray table. "Detective," Dominique said, her voice completely level. "Before you begin, I have a time-stamped account of everything that occurred on this flight, forwarded to Palisade's legal department, along with video from a passenger in row 4. I believe the woman who called this in is Senior Purser Renee Castellan, and I'd like you to know she made that call before making a public statement acknowledging she'd made an error. I'd like to walk you through the timeline. Detective Delgado looked at her, looked at Renee standing at the galley curtain with the stillness of someone who understood a thing was happening, now that could not be undone. Looked back at Dominique. Miss Castellan, she said, you made this call. I did, Renee said. But that was before. Before what, specifically? Renee didn't finish the sentence. Captain Whitlock stepped forward from the cockpit doorway, hat back on, and said, Detective, I can confirm Miss Ashworth's ownership status. I received confirmation from a corporate contact and independently verified it through the airline's own registration records before I grounded this aircraft. She is the majority owner of this airline. Detective Delgado turned back to Renee. The look on her face wasn't dramatic. It was the flat, informational look of someone whose picture had just become complete. Filing a false report is a criminal matter, officer, she said. Not to Dominique, but to the two officers behind her. Making that call under knowingly false pretenses is a separate charge. Using law enforcement to retaliate against a passenger you have a personal conflict with is a third. And given her personnel file, 3 prior complaints, none investigated, this isn't going to read like an isolated incident to a prosecutor. It's going to read like a pattern with a badge number attached to the last chapter. I was protecting the integrity of the cabin, Renee said, one final time, to no one who was still willing to hear it. I followed protocol as I understood it in the moment. You followed nothing, Detective Delgado said. You made a decision about who belonged in that seat before you ever looked at a single document, and then you spent 40 minutes finding reasons to justify a decision you'd already made. That's not protocol, Miss Castellan. That's a habit. And habits like that don't stay contained to one flight. Renee Castellan walked the length of the first-class aisle for the last time as a Palisade Airways employee, past Walter Grimshaw, who finally looked up, past Eleanor Voss, who did not look away, past seat 1A, which she did not look at all. Nobody applauded. Nobody said a word. The silence that followed her down that aisle was heavier than applause would have been. The silence of 211 people, watching an accounting finally, quietly, complete itself. 6 weeks later, Renee Castellan's employment with Palisade Airways was formally terminated following an independent review that surfaced the 3 buried complaints in her file, plus 2 additional incidents that had been withdrawn before ever reaching paper, recovered through an internal email audit Dominique's legal team had ordered as part of the broader post-acquisition review. 3 months after that, the district attorney's office in Mecklenburg County filed formal charges, false report to law enforcement, and a separate civil complaint brought jointly by 2 of her former co-workers whose original complaints had never been investigated. She never once, in any deposition, in any hearing, said the word sorry without a qualifier stapled to the end of it. She said she'd followed protocol as she understood it. She said she'd been trying to protect the crew. She never said she was wrong, because somewhere underneath 24 years of Navy blazers, she had never once let herself believe she could be. Nolan Cassidy, the younger flight attendant who'd confirmed the clean booking and then said nothing else the rest of that morning, resigned the week before his own review concluded. He sent 1 email, not to HR, not to legal, directly to Dominique's office. It read, I almost did something I would not have recovered from. I didn't. I don't expect anything for that. I just needed you to know I know what almost happened. Dominique read it once. She wrote 1 sentence back. Almost is the whole ball game. Make the right call next time. Captain Marcus Whitlock was named Vice President of West Coast Flight Operations, a position that had sat vacant for nearly 2 years and that everyone in the building had quietly known should have been his the whole time. He accepted on one condition, that a mandatory crew de-escalation and bias awareness program roll out across every Palisade route within 12 months. Dominique agreed before he finished the sentence. Journalist Julian Cross's piece ran at just over 4,000 words under the headline, "The Seat She Already Owned," and it was read 11 million times in its first 2 days. It didn't make Dominique famous. She'd already been known in the rooms where that kind of knowing mattered, and she'd always cared more about the rooms than the fame. What the piece did was give language to something millions of readers had lived through in airports, in hotel lobbies, in bank branches, in every space where belonging gets decided by someone else before you've said a single word. The comments filled for days with stories from people who didn't have a lawyer's number saved in their phone, who didn't own the airline, who'd never once gotten the chance to be believed. The Federal Aviation Administration's regional office opened its own inquiry 2 weeks after the district attorney filed charges. Prompted by the pattern of buried complaints, rather than by the viral video alone, and Renee's certification as a crew safety lead was suspended pending review. A suspension that, given the finding of a documented false report to law enforcement, her attorney privately told her was unlikely to ever be lifted. She would not fly for Palisade again. She would not, as it turned out, fly commercially for anyone again. The industry is smaller than people assume, and 24 years of Navy blazers does not survive a sentence like knowingly false pretenses attached permanently to a personnel record other airlines can request. Grant Weller's coup attempt fell apart within the hour. Farah had promised. His bylaw challenge was ruled void. The moment Senator Lowell's office confirmed the conflict of interest reading in writing, and he was out of the building by 3 o'clock that same afternoon. Still, according to 2 people in that conference room, insisting there'd been a misunderstanding about the timing of his litigation disclosure. He never publicly acknowledged the attempt at all. Some people, it turns out, are built the same way in a boardroom as they are behind a galley curtain. Eleanor Voss sent Dominique a handwritten note 2 weeks later, forwarded through the airline's customer relations desk. It said, only, "You looked exactly the way I taught 7th graders to look when someone tries to make them small. Like you'd already decided you weren't going to shrink." Dominique kept that note in the inside pocket of her blazer for 3 months and 41 flights. At LAX, 5 months after Charlotte, walking toward a gate for a flight to Boston, Dominique noticed a young black woman, maybe 23, standing at the entrance to the first-class boarding lane with a valid pass in one hand, and the specific, almost invisible hesitation of someone waiting to be questioned before she'd done anything to earn it. Dominique touched the compass at her collarbone once, the same way she'd touched it in the back seat of that car 3 hours before the whole world learned who she was. "You're in the right place," she said quietly, walking past. "Keep walking." The young woman looked back once, checking, surprised, and then she walked forward. The door closed behind them both. Outside, the same wide, indifferent, endlessly available Los Angeles sky that had been there above every door that had ever tried to hold her back opened up ahead of them the way it always does for the people who refuse to turn around. If this story moved you, if you felt that particular ache in your chest, watching someone hand over proof and get looked past anyway, do one thing for me before you go. Hit like, because it's the only way this story finds the next person who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's ever been made to feel small in a room they had every right to be in. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in that seat? Or have you ever been the one standing at the front of that aisle? I read every single one. This is a work of original fiction. All characters, incidents, and dialogue are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.